Happy Sunday, everyone. Hope you are all doing wonderful. Today, we are talking about what would it look like to go back in time in the church. Let's just say a couple of decades. This question was prompted in part by me sharing my recent book, The Slow Stain, with a friend. And in the introduction to that book, I reference the movie The Matrix, how these artificial intelligent machines had created a fake virtual reality in which humans were living, unbeknownst to them, that even though it was like 2197 or some far off year in the future, they were living in this dream world that was set to the year 1999. And I mentioned in the book what is mentioned in the movie by Agent Smith, where he talks about 1999 as the peak of human civilization. So in the Slow Stain book, I kind of lean into that a little bit. I talk about how during that time is when we get the proclamation and some of the context in which, proclamation on the family, I should say, and some of the context in which that arose. But thinking about that story caused me to reflect a little bit more broadly on things inside the church and what has changed since then. And so I wondered, just for my own mental exercise, what has changed in the past couple of decades. And of course, we can go all the way to 1999. I figured for simplicity, we could do just the past, even 10 years, but up to 15 or 20 if we wanted to kind of think about what have been some of the big changes. You may recall that when President Nelson was called to his position, his wife, Wendy, gave what some thought was kind of a not revealing interview, but kind of open and frank, perhaps more so than we often get. And among the things she said in that interview was this.
Just because it was tradition, man, he's not just about, if it was tradition, let's do something different. It's, let's look at why were we doing that? And that's what has caught his attention over and over again when he sees things and says, what are we doing that for? What are we spending the widow's mite on that for?
Now, I appreciate this perspective because the scriptures are very clear about the problems with the traditions of our fathers. And there are a lot of things that have over the, past 2 centuries crept into the church that ought not be there. And there are tares growing amongst the wheat, and there are traditions because we are human and it's what we do, right? So I appreciate that about President Nelson in particular. And it reminded me of this story that President Oaks shared at President Nelson's memorial upon his passing.
I saw this contrast in the first meeting of the new first presidency. A question came before us to decide who should write the introductory page in the monthly issue of the Ensign magazine. First presidency members had done this for many years. Before President Eyring and I could get involved in any discussion of which one of us would do that, President Nelson said, "Why do we do this? Is this really necessary? Let's stop doing it." The decision was quickly made. That approach was repeated again and again as I saw President Nelson as the decision maker rather than the wise and supportive member of the Quorum of the 12 I had sat beside for 34 years. Figuratively speaking, I tightened my seatbelt a few more notches and said to myself, being a counselor in this first presidency is going to be fun.
Now, if that interview from Sister Nelson looked familiar, it's likely because of the following quote that she made from that same interview.
I have seen him changing in the last 10 months. It is as though he's been unleashed.
And I think we all know that that's what happened. President Nelson made a number of changes, right? President Monson was more just kind of I'll call him a stabilizer, right? Just continuing things as they were. President Hinckley made a few changes. His was more around communications. He was a communications guy. So certainly escalating the number of temples under President Hinckley. Obviously the proclamation on the family, if we're going back over 30 years. but largely, more of the same and just communicating better about our story and our theology and, I'm a Mormon type films and social media campaigns and all of that. And so President Nelson, I read his wife's, statement as he had a lot of disagreements. Certainly, and I'll talk about this in a bit, his disagreement with President Hinckley that had gone on for years around using the term Mormon. And so for him to be unleashed was that he had a lot on his mind, a lot that he wanted to change, it would appear. You may also recall this little snippet he gave towards the beginning of his call.
There's much more to come. Wait till next year. Eat your vitamin pills. Get your rest. It's going to be exciting.
So, vitamin pills, get your rest. He's unleashed lots of changes. So I wanted to go through what some of those changes were and reflect on, now that we're on the opposite side of them, what are they like? Some good, some bad from my perspective, from one guy musing. And there's minor stuff, of course, that I'm not even going to spend time, digging into, such as merging the church magazines into one, now having the Liahona, dropping the first presidency statement, as President Oaks talked about, reinstating opening prayers in the second hour, changing tithing settlement to tithing declaration, allowing women and kids to be baptismal witnesses, lots of other changes like these that I'll call more minor in comparison. But I wanted to spend a moment going through what I consider to be, I'll call it the top 10 major changes made predominantly during President Nelson's administration, though one of them slightly predates him, I think, but this is a guy who changed a lot of stuff. And so I think it could be interesting to spend a moment to reflect on some of those changes and what we feel about them as of now. So the first one that I'll get into is the combination of the high priests and elders into a single quorum. This was one of kind of many changes made around the Come Follow Me era, lots of restructuring. I'll talk about some of the others in a moment. But combining those two quorums into one, I don't really like, and I don't think it's working well. I think of it like, mixing middle school and high school students in one class. There's just different age and cultural differences that I think would be better to separate so that the class instruction could better hone in on, topics that pertain directly to what each group is going through, right? So mixing them together, in my experience, has not gone over well. And obviously, this is just me musing. This is my own anecdotal experience in my ward, some other wards I've visited, conversations I've had with, friends and family and others about their experience. But I'm not too much of a fan of this one. I do think it'd be better to separate the high priests and elders back into their original quorums / age groupings for, I think, more meaningful discussion around, what each type of group is going through. Another big change that was made was replacing home and visiting teaching with ministering. I think the ideal here is good, right? Trying to say, hey, let's not have such a formal, ritualistic type of thing. Let's reach for kind of the more aspirational thing of just ministering to one another. I think what's become evident, perhaps, is that human beings benefit from structure in a way, or in some circumstances. And from many, many conversations I've had with others around this, as well as my own experience, this has completely fallen flat. And where home teaching, success rate percentages were low to begin with, ministering is even lower. If you have other experiences, by the way, to this or anything else, please share in the comments, because I'm always interested in, particularly on topics like this, differing perspectives, or I should say experiences. If, say, in your ward, ministering is really successful. If so, why? What is leading that to be successful? Because I think most people, if not nearly everybody I talk to, from their own ministering or being ministered to, like speaking personally, the only thing that could be counted as ministering for years and years, and however many years it's been, 5 or whenever they made the change, more, So was that the 20? I didn't look up the year, but it's been a number of years, right? This might have been a 2018 thing. I think we've gotten a jar of jelly once dropped off to one of our kids who answered the door. Now I don't say that with any malice, because I myself personally was never a fan of home teaching or ministering as a program. In a broad sense, absolutely, I agree with ministering. Our family goes, to decent efforts to try to care for others. Hey, someone's sick, let's bring them a meal, give them some support. How can we help? Someone's moving in, someone had a baby, other people are in need, can we donate? Can we support? So I think ministering as a concept is excellent, right? It is what Christ wants us to do. I've just never been a fan of the arbitrarily kind of mandated like pairing up of people. That's never really made sense to me, right? More, I would prefer like, hey, just minister to people in your ward, people who live close to you, people, you may not encounter, people who live near you. And if we all do that, then we get kind of the geographic coverage rather than this like assignment program. It never sat well with me in home teaching. It hasn't ministering. So I'm not a good minister according to the program. But, I do think it's important to authentically and organically minister to people. So, in fact, when it came out, I can't recall if this was from the top or my local leader, but I remember there being this moment of like, oh, and even if it means texting someone just to check in, that counts. Everything counts. Just let's be there for one another. And so like what's stuck in people's heads is like, oh, I can just text once in a while. Like, hey, how you doing? Anything I can help you with? So I don't think this program is working. Honestly, I feel like home teaching / visiting teaching had better success rates, had better guardrails around it, created a structure through which more people could more meaningfully do it. Again, notwithstanding my objections and issues I have with it, I do feel like the success rate was higher. To which someone might say, well, the law of Moses had a more ritualistic structure type of thing, but it was the lower law and people had to obey the higher law. Like there's certainly an argument, I think, to be made there. Which brings me to my next observation, and that is the youth program, in particular for the boys, right? Because we got out of the Boy Scout program. The church launched to much fanfare the new youth program. You longtime listeners will recall that last December, I did a musing all about this called New Youth Program Success or Failure. I will link to this and the other musings that I'm going to mention in the description of the YouTube version of this video, depending on where you're listening. Alternatively, you can just go to sundaymusings.org and you can type this stuff in and you'll find it there. So this one was called New Youth Program Success or Failure, in which I talked about not only my thoughts, but many others that I think it's a spectacular failure. I think youth in particular needs structure. You can say that adults shouldn't need it, that we should no more be like children, tossed to and fro like the wind, et cetera, although I think many people are infantilized in a gospel intellectual sense in terms of their understanding and being at a milk level, as I talked about a few months ago, and another musing about milk versus meat. But youth do need structure. They're very clearly still developing. They don't have the excuse that adults do, that they just have not applied themselves to, pursue the meat and no longer need the bumper guards in the bowling alley. But youth do need the structure, and they don't have it. And the youth leaders are not trained. There's no, like, at least in Boy Scouts, there was, training you'd go through. There was a system in place. There was structure. There was guidance. There was expectations. There was accountability. There were challenges. There were rituals. There was community. Like, I had a lot of problems with Boy Scouts, and I've shared about that before. But it far surpasses what young men are experiencing now. And I say that as someone who, for a period of time, was a youth, whatever they call it these days, not a leader, but one of the adult supporters in the teacher's quorum when my son was in there. And I believe it's in the conclusion to my book, Slow Stain, where it's in my forthcoming book, Rise Up, where I talk about it. So I have a book coming out, I think in April is when I'm going to release it, called Rise Up. I'm going to be doing a musing about this as we get closer, but this one's all about men and boys. Rise up, O men of God. And why? What are the reasons why men and boys aren't rising up today? What are the challenges? If you're familiar with that hymn, Rise up, O men of God, have done with lesser things, give heart and soul and mind and strength to serve the King of Kings. I basically take that hymn and expand it into book form and talk about all this stuff. So in the conclusion of that book, I kind of lean into this issue a little bit, that boys all over the place, but especially or even in the church, are having huge problems and not getting the support they need. And the program that exists now is just a failure, and it's not providing what boys need. And I feel like it's just going to lead to more drift, more faith abandonment, more community abandonment, people leaving the church either in name or in practice. So I think the church program has been a fail, and I think it needs a huge reset. And I think there has to be far better structure for young people. I'm not saying we should rejoin the Boy Scouts. We could create something similar in a lot of ways, but it would require, I think, a lot more structure, a lot more expectation, a lot more training of adults. Right now, youth leaders are not trained. They have the goals, right? The spiritual goals, intellectual goals, physical goals, and whatever the other one was, I'm not remembering. Social goals. And I remember as a adult leader, whatever they call it, in our quorum, I would always, the youth are supposed to lead. So I'd be suggesting activities, and inevitably it always devolved into the recreational social side. Let's play games. Let's do this, and I would try to encourage intellectual activities or spiritual, right? And, that's not what the boys wanted. There weren't expectations there. There wasn't structure. There wasn't process. It was like, oh, it's up to you to decide. And like even the goal setting, it's just no one was doing it, and it was very hard to impose those expectations or encourage it, and it's just not working well. So I think this one's been a dud. I think some major changes are needed, and fast. Another big change in the top 10, as I mentioned earlier, was the abandonment of the term Mormon. And not just the abandonment thereof, but the attack on it, the equating of it with being a victory for Satan, as President Nelson said. This is, as I mentioned, kind of a longer disagreement that President Nelson and President Hinckley had. President Nelson gave a talk on this topic. 6 months later, President Hinckley gave a talk basically undercutting what he had said. I talk about this in my musing from July 2024, called President Nelson's Anti-Mormon Campaign. Again, I mean anti-Mormon in the sense that he was attacking, the term Mormon. It was my title was a play on words a little bit. So again, link in the YouTube description, or go to sundaymusings.org and type in President Nelson or anti-Mormon or something, you'll find it. The point being that I think this has become a pharisaical weaponization of anyone who mentions Mormon. And I'm curious to see with President Nelson having passed, if, President Oaks continues this. Certainly as you look at the data, and every different church leader has their own little hobby, term or catchphrase, every member a missionary, right? Or linked in your stride, or all these things. And I've done a musing on this in the past, changing Mormon catchphrases. It kind of dies out after a while, right? Or you have Elder Bednar talking about tender mercies, and all of a sudden everyone's talking about tender mercies, and then it kind of fizzles and fades. So I suspect, I hope, that this issue will kind of fade away with President Nelson, because I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Do I think it's good to acknowledge the name of Jesus Christ, to reference the name of the church correctly, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? 100%. But this idea that we shouldn't say I'm a Mormon or you're a Mormon, or communitarian wise, like as a community, we are Mormons, rather than we are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I see a separation, as I point in that musing, between when you're stating the name of the church and when you're talking about the people. And I give an example from 4th Nephi in that musing, where, the followers of God were called Nephites. And that was the term used for it in a very approving, positive, way, as a shorthand, as a shortcut, basically, right? Not to say that, oh my gosh, because they didn't mention Jesus Christ all the time. If anything, there are examples in Scripture of not, using the name of the Lord so frequently. So anyways, I think this was another thing that hopefully subsides, and I think was a little bit too much of a campaign, and has created some unfortunate tension, or equating, like, oh, anyone who it's like one of those like scarlet letters, right? Oh, you said Mormon, you used the term Mormon, therefore I can automatically infer into that you are not, consistently doing what you're told and obedient and blah, 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 right? I just think that's unhealthy and unnecessary. Another one is shortening Sunday musings to Sunday musings. 2 hours would be a long Sunday musing. Thankfully, most are under an hour. Shortening Sunday meetings to 2 hours. Now, this, I feel like, kind of relates to the earlier one about combining quorums, right? Because, well, maybe not. Part of shortening to 2 hours was cramming more wards in the same building and then overlapping more. And anyways, so I feel like shortening to 2 hours has decreased the feeling of community. And on the one hand, I feel like maybe that's true, and maybe it's also I've talked about in other musings about community, like cultural centers, and how the use of cultural centers have changed over time, and they're no longer cultural, and we don't really have as much community as we do. But that's not specific only to our church. That's just kind of the rise of the internet and social media, and now our community is more online and virtual, and people don't derive the same sense of community like they did at the peak of civilization, according to The Matrix in 1999. Where you'd have, linger longers, or you'd have more activities, or you'd hang out and visit after church because you didn't have Facebook to have already gotten updates on people's lives. And so you would spend time asking them, and you'd create more interpersonal connection and relationships. So this could just be a function of culture overall changing, and probably largely is, right? But I don't think it helps to cut church from 3 hours to 2. I think it decreases the opportunity for community and connection. I feel like it also, I know it decreases the opportunity for instruction. The fact that you're only having Sunday school every other week, the fact that you're only in your quorum every other week, it like if you're trying to learn Russian as a language and you're only doing it once a week, granted church isn't, you should be studying this stuff at home, right? The gospel. But the point is, like, if you're only doing this class every other week, it doesn't really give time for like connection or even continuity, because you come back to class and you're like, what did we talk about 2 weeks ago, and where did we leave off, and when we have now 2 weeks of material to cover in 1 hour, and so it creates lessons that are rushed and leaving out a ton of stuff that could be very enriching if we had more regular opportunities to be digging into this. And so, I know a lot of people like the 2 hour church and they would like 1 hour church, and there's a lot of reasons why I also like 2 hours of church, especially as I talked about in a musing a few months ago. If Sunday school is boring, right, and you're not getting a lot from your church, then I know a lot of you will get fulfillment from these Sunday musings, or I'll go home and I'll be doing my own research for the next Sunday musing. That's very fulfilling to me, to be spending time just researching and learning and understanding, or, listening to whatever, right, music or other podcasts and so forth. But I do feel like this policy was a bit of a dud, in the sense that it has not been more beneficial than the cost. The juice has been not worth the squeeze. And so I would actually support going back to 3 hours, and alongside that being more intentional with trying to build community. And I say that as kind of a introvert, antisocial curmudgeon. And my wife, who listens faithfully to all of these, will, acknowledge that fact. I'm flying all over the country all the time. I have, 150 plus people working in our organization. I'm regularly interacting with a ton of people, like, viewers, listeners like you, social media, whatever. Like, I feel like I get a lot of connection already, sufficient for my needs. And so I don't feel the need to, like, spend a ton of time with someone who just happened to purchase a piece of property down the road from me. Like, that's the reason why there should be this connection. Not to say there aren't great people, and many of whom I consider friends, who live in my neighborhood and in my ward. But so I'm not someone who's like, oh, I need community from the ward. But I do recognize in the aggregate, on the whole, that's going to be more beneficial for more people, especially young people who are increasingly isolated. They're worried about, dating. They're worried about having friends in the gospel, all this kind of stuff, right? So I would say 3 hours is better than 2. Another change that I think going back to the youth program, the young men's presidency was eliminated several years back with all these changes. And I think that's not been great, because the bishopric was turned into the young men's presidency effectively. But these guys are busy. They always have been. And even with some of the other changes made, they still are. And it's hard to have a meaningful amount of intentional planning and thoughtfulness when your mind is full of all kinds of other problems and challenges and things that you're dealing with. So I don't think, I mean, young women still have presidencies or a ward presidency. I'm not talking about the quorum or class presidency. I'm saying overarching ward presidency. And I think it would be better to restore that alongside a better youth program so that a young men's presidency could be the ones to intentionally support and oversee and implement that program. But right now it's very difficult to get meaningful amounts of time, or I should say even energy. Even if you get the time, the energy is hard on the part of like any bishopric member who's overworked, exhausted, and has their own work life and family life and everything else on top. It just, I think, has not been good for the young men. And I would love to see it restored. Continuing with the youth theme, this is a positive change. The new standards for bishop interviews with youth. So you may recall that several years ago, changes were made, I think in part because of, there was some outside pressure and people complaining about this. And sometimes, many times, the church will make accommodations and changes in response to heat, optics. And so this policy change was made whereby bishop interviews of youth are now open to parental awareness and attendance. And so including parents in an interview with the youth, should they want to do so, just to make sure everything's above board. It's generally never a good idea to have an adult male privately meeting with and discussing like sexual sins or topics to determine chastity of anyone, especially a minor female. So I think this has been a positive change to just say, this can be with parents attending. Now, of course, if, mom is sitting in with you, maybe you're going to be less honest than if a bishop is asking you outright. But that's just another topic of your own, disclosure and honesty and whatever. I feel like this is for the better to just say, when we're dealing with kids, parents are included should they choose to do so. I think that was a good decision that's been made. And continuing with our youth theme for yet another one, the changes to the For the Strength of Youth pamphlet. I think this is another good thing that has happened. I did a musing October of 2022 on this one called For the Strength of Adults, in which I highlighted the new changes in the, pamphlet, not a manual, for the youth, and how in general those changes were broader and higher level in the sense that it wasn't like, don't wear 2 pairs of earrings and don't listen to this and don't do that. It wasn't this like overly prescriptive thing as it had been in the past. It was much more about, here's the principle. It was much more along the lines of Joseph Smith, right? I teach men correct principles and let them govern themselves. And so in that musing, I talked about how the For the Strength of Manual for Youth could merit some changes for adults, when you're talking about, say, Word of Wisdom or whatever. And so again, you can go to sundaymusings.org and look that one up. But I do think these changes are beneficial. And I did say earlier that youth need more structure. So you might be thinking, well, wait a minute. On the one hand, with the youth program, Connor was saying we need more structure, and the lack of structure has not been good for youth. But then here with For the Strength of Youth, he's saying less structure or less prescriptive, nitpicky, whatever is better. But I see a functional difference between a program full of activities and goals and behavioral, stuff that we want kids doing versus like almost, here are doctrinal principles to follow in your life. Because in different cultural contexts and different ages and different family dynamics, those principles might look different. And they get pharisaical if they get prescriptive and nitpicky and specific. And so I think it was better to keep, again, teach correct principles, let people govern themselves. And I think that's better in a lot of ways in other areas that I talked about in that past musing. Another change that was made, this one got another musing in July of 2023, was the removal of the Cornerstone ceremony for new temples. That musing was called Modern Mormonism and the Abandonment of Ritual. I talked about this Cornerstone ceremony primarily, but some other examples as well. How in early church days, Joseph, the Lord through Joseph was talking about the importance of the cornerstone. The New Testament, Jesus doing the same, talking about, that he's the head of the corner, etc. And the cornerstone was this like symbolic connection to Christ, that this is the house of the Lord. Jesus being the chief cornerstone, they would have a cornerstone ceremony that later morphed into like a capstone ceremony where it had nothing to do with the actual cornerstone based on modern building code, whatever. So then they always had that like ceremonial little fake stone that they would put in with some, what do you call that? Goop, the cement type stuff that they would do. And they'd take a photo, and it was more of a photo op than any type of like, ceremony per se that was deeply spiritual and connected to Christ. And then now with like the modern, prefabricated Lego piece temple building that they're doing, now they've even done away with this other stone idea. So President Oaks was actually the last one a couple years back to do a ceremony of any kind connected to this, and now they've just done away with it. And I'm mixed on this one. We don't do just like President Nelson, right? It's like, let's analyze these traditions of our fathers and see if, should we do this, should we not? So, but I do feel like this has enough scriptural precedent and divine connection that, if we're building temples, it would be something helpful to do. So not the biggest issue, but, as I said in that previous musing, the abandonment of ritual, abandoning some rituals is very important, and purging ourselves of the traditions is good. But there's other kind of ritual and connection to God and helping remind us of these things that would be important to retain. So I've got mixed feelings on that one. For my concluding top 10, this one is more of a personal pet peeve than a big issue. And this is the one I mentioned earlier where this wasn't really, so far as I could find, President Nelson decreeing, or as President Oak said, deciding. He's the decider. I couldn't place that connection. This may have started to shift slightly before him. If you know differently, let me know. But this one is about shifting lessons in Elders Quorum and Relief Society to be based on a General Conference talk. And not just Elders Quorum and Relief Society lessons, but now it has bled into sacrament meeting talks, that when those are assigned, they're talks about talks. Just this morning when I was earlier at church, it was the same thing. It was a talk about a talk. So, before in Elders Quorum Relief Society, we had for years and years and years the Teachings of the Presidents of the Church manual, right? And so you'd go through the manual, you'd read a bunch of quotes from that leader, you'd talk about the topic, and that was like the structure of those classes. And then that was done away with. It looks like, I have to go back and look, but it was kind of around the time that President Nelson started. And, they did create a Teachings of the Presidents of, President Nelson book, but they had already pivoted away from that being the curriculum. Before there was a different lesson manual for Elders Quorum, for Sunday school. So Come Follow Me kind of seems to be when all these changes were being made, where now this has been so pervasive a thing throughout the church that I can't help but think that it came from the top. I just could not pinpoint any specific announcement or anything. So if you know differently, let me know. Maybe this was from the Sunday school presidency and it just kind of percolated through the stakes. Maybe some letter was sent out I couldn't find. I don't know. But this isn't like a local, like a Utah thing or whatever. This is all over the place. So clearly there's like some like correlation committee decision that's like trickling down, everywhere. And I think this was a huge mistake. Like, sure, there's a lot to be gleaned from past talks, whether in General Conference or elsewhere. I'm not saying never reference them or that there's not, good to be extracted there. But I think this has encouraged such lazy class instruction, if you can even call it that, and lazy talks where people just kind of meander through someone else's talk and their structure and their stories. And obviously this is on a spectrum. Some people are very horrible and they'll just cling to the talk and just, let's each take a turn reading a paragraph, right? And then talk a little bit about it. And then on the other hand, some people will plan their own lesson with their own story and their own thoughts and just incorporate several select quotes from the original talk. But I just think this has just produced mediocrity in our classes and in our talks. I don't think this has been good at all. And so call it a pet peeve. I'll say it's something bigger than just a pet peeve. I think this has been a bad policy, and I would love to see it done away with. Sure, again, like, hey, we'd like you to speak in sacrament on this topic, and leave it up to the person to go research what talks. Let them be inspired. Maybe the suggested talk you give them is, fine, but now you're gonna, slothful servant is commanded in all things type of thing, right? And being that humans like to follow the path of least resistance and conserve mental energy, they're likely just going to stick with what you gave rather than challenging them, right? Hey, spend some time studying this topic, read multiple talks, read a lot of scriptures, pray about it, reflect on it, develop your own thoughts, have ChatGPT help you, whatever, right? Like, have people own this and spend more time with it rather than just meandering through past talks. I just don't think the outcome has been good. Again, there's a lot of great stuff in past talks that can be referenced and shared, no question. But using them as the kind of basis for lessons and talks and all that, I don't think it's gone well. So imagine, I think that was my last one. So imagine, rewinding the church a decade or two. If all of these were undone, or if we just fully reset the past, 10, 20 years, would that be a good thing or a bad thing? At least my list, I think it's far more positives than negatives, or in the sense that if we rewound and got rid of them, that would be on the whole a positive thing, because most of these in my mind have been negatives in the sense that they haven't turned out to be great. Again, this is just anecdotal. This might be because a lot of my network and family and personal experiences in Utah. Maybe this is more of a Utah thing. Maybe the mission field, so-called, has been a little less, contaminated by some of these things. So please, in the comments, let me know your own experience with any of these. I'd be curious if you've, in your wards, have been able to pivot around or adapt or, whatever to some of these. But bluntly speaking, I feel like if these major church policies were reset by 20 years, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, which is a very interesting thing to think about. So yes, President Nelson was unleashed. Some of us took our vitamin pills. A lot of things were, changed. And I'm not one who opposes change. There's a lot of people that cling to the traditions of the fathers. They cling to the status quo. Oh, 3 hours church. Don't change that. It's a fallen church now because you made the change. Like, no, I'm completely on board with change. I talk about often a lot of changes I think need to make. For me, the issue is not that things were changed. It's what was changed. And so clearly I've got some, disagreements here, but I'm, again, sincerely curious from your perspective, if you've seen in your wards, in your area where you live, particularly those of you who are international, if you've seen substantially different outcomes in some of these. About half of these topics that I just went through, the major ones, I've done musings on, as I said. And so in those musings, I think people in the comments, and you can go look yourself, but I think more often than not, they erred on the side of agreement to say, like, yeah, this has been an issue, particularly the youth program one. There was a lot of consensus around that. But please, again, if you differ, if you've seen something different, I'm curious to know what has led to that different outcome and why it's different. But certainly if you kind of share these views and have some similar concerns, I'd be curious if you'd feel like it was okay to do a reset in the matrix back to the peak of 1999 civilization. I say that with a bit of bias because I was 18. I was living in my heyday. Those were good times, but I'm sure a lot of it's just nostalgia and bias and, the age that I was at the time. But I might agree with Agent Smith. 1999 was pretty awesome. Let me know in the comments what you think, and I'll see you guys next Sunday.